right, thanks very much. Good morning, everyone. Very pleased to present this paper with my great and frequent co-author, Andy Lewis-Pye, who's a professor at London School of Economics, on Beyond Optimal Fault Tolerance. Quick disclosure, so I am head of research at A16Z Crypto, but obviously this is a purely academic talk. Don't take this as financial advice, please. I want to focus on what's really kind of the most basic consensus problem that we study in the context of blockchain protocols, so state-machine replication. So the consensus layer of a blockchain protocol is really just sort of an ordering machine, in effect, right? So transactions are coming in from an environment or from users, and the responsibility of the consensus layer is to compile these into a transaction sequence, a sequence of finalized transactions, okay? And each of the validators, each of the machines running this blockchain protocol, they're going to maintain their own append-only list of finalized transactions. At a bare minimum, we'll want more properties than this, but at a bare minimum, you want a protocol satisfying consistency and liveness. More on that on the next slide. Despite the fact, and this is what makes the problem potentially hard, the network may be unreliable, and some of the validators themselves may be unreliable or faulty. Okay? So just to make sure everyone's clear on what I mean by consistency and liveness of a state-machine replication of a SMR protocol. So consistency, right? Each validator has their own local log of the transaction sequence that they're regarding as finalized. So consistency just says that everybody should agree. There shouldn't be any incompatibilities between what different validators view as finalized. It's okay if some are lagging behind, so this picture would be fine. These validators basically agree. Validator number 2 just has to catch up with validator number 1. That would not be a consistency violation. This is what a consistency violation looks like. And we will be concerned with these quite a bit in this talk. 2 different validators, and the messages that they have received have led them to regard fundamentally incompatible sequence of transactions being finalized. That's a consistency violation. Okay, so we don't want those, and in this talk, if we have them, we're going to be interested in recovering from them. Okay? So if you wanted to never have consistency violations, very easy way to do it would just be to never finalize any transactions. So of course you need a corresponding liveness condition, which just says as long as there's work to be done, it gets done. As long as users are submitting valid transactions, those transactions should eventually be finalized by all of the honest validators. Okay, so at a bare minimum, we want consistency and liveness for an SMR protocol. All right, so this will sort of wrap up the review. So our starting point is also going to be just a completely traditional model of message delays, which is a hybrid between synchrony and asynchrony called partial synchrony. And so the idea here is we're going to start with an asynchronous phase of unknown duration, and there'll be some moment in time called GST for global stabilization time. There'll be some moment in time eventually where the network starts functioning properly, i.e. it starts acting like the synchronous model, okay? So GST is adversarially chosen. Protocol has no idea what GST might be. After GST, the network functions normally in the sense that messages are delivered within delta time steps. Delta here is known to the protocol, so a protocol description can depend on delta, independent of GST, but can depend on delta, okay? And in the 80s, it was resolved what is the optimal fault tolerance in partial synchrony in a paper by Dwork, Lynch, and Stockmeyer. So if the magical threshold here turns out the famous threshold is 1/3, so if less than 1/3 of the validators are faulty, are Byzantine, then in fact you can guarantee consistency even pre-GST, even when the network is asynchronous. And then once the network is functioning normally, that is after GST, you get not just liveness, but you get finalizing of transactions quickly and time scaling with the post-GST network speed delta, okay? So this is the positive result. It's not just a theoretical result. Many protocols that you know and love, Tendermint, Casper, et cetera, do satisfy this guarantee, okay? All right, so this was known in the 80s. So what is there to do in a paper in 2025? So we're gonna be looking for protocols that, while also satisfying optimal fault tolerance in partial synchrony, in addition, we want extra credit or icing on the cake. We want further properties to be true of these protocols, perhaps specifically for subsets of executions that satisfy additional assumptions. Okay, so we're never going to compromise on this baseline requirement that in partial synchrony, we're guaranteed consistent, we're guaranteed live after GST, but we also want additional properties perhaps for a subset of executions. So what additional properties might we want? So in this talk, we're going to think about going into this dangerous regime where there are 1/3 or more Byzantine validators, okay? So again, we know from the 1980s that 1/3 is a magical threshold. No, if you design your protocol properly, you can guarantee no consistency violations. We have less than 1/3 faulty validators. If there's at least 1/3 faulty validators, no matter how smart your protocol is, you are vulnerable to consistency violations. They may in fact occur. And so the question I want to ask is, what possible guarantees could we achieve in this region with a large adversary, okay? And so the better than optimal or beyond optimal in the title refers to guarantees that apply even in the regime which we historically thought of as sort of hopeless, where the adversary is so large that you're sort of doomed to failure. And specifically, we'll pursue consistency resilience, but again, F is bigger than n over 3 here, and we have that famous impossibility result from the 1980s. So in exchange, we will pursue that for a relaxed definition of consistency, which is what I'm going to talk about next. Okay. So that wraps up the review. I think probably that was well known to many of you. This is going to start the part of the talk which is about stuff that's novel in the paper. Okay. So suppose we have a large adversary, okay, at least a third Byzantine nodes. So consistency violation may well occur. All right. How can we relax this? How can we say we don't completely, we still get some meaningful guarantee? So here's the initial idea. So okay, there will be moments in time when some pair of validators will disagree, have incompatible ideas of the sequence of finalized transactions. Maybe we can just make it so that that only happens for a small, meaning bounded amount of time, okay? So, okay, what would that mean? Well, so the first thing to realize is, okay, if it's only going to be incompatible for a bounded amount of time, that means, if you ever have a consistency violation at some moment in time, I guess there has to be a future moment in time where you don't have it anymore. So I guess that means like somehow there must be an in-protocol recovery procedure that reestablishes consistency necessarily by rolling back some of the transactions that you had thought were finalized, okay? That's a prerequisite for having a bounded amount of time in which there's a consistency violation. Okay? There needs to be an in-protocol recovery procedure that rolls back some thought to be finalized transactions. All right, so if we were going to pursue that approach, what properties would we want our protocol to have? And the thing to always remember, right, so this is this kind of regime we're not used to thinking of, or most of us are not used to thinking about, where the adversary is large, already large enough to cause consistency violations, and therefore, for all we know, maybe already large enough to do foil lots of other wishes we might have as well, okay? So that's the worry, but like what would we like? Well, if we only want the consistency violation to persist for a bounded amount of time, the recovery time procedure should complete in a bounded amount of time. We'll call that D. It shouldn't be the case that you have consistency violations over and over and over and over and over again. So there should be a bounded number of times that you have a consistency violation. We'll call that R. And finally, we would really prefer not to sort of recover consistency by rolling back 15 years worth of blockchain history and going back to Genesis. We would also like some control over how old the transactions might be that are going to be rolled back. We would like only recently finalized transactions to be rolled back, so that's H. D, R, and H, we would like all of them to be as small as possible, okay? From the traditional work, from the stuff of the 1980s, what do we know? We know that if F is less than n over 3, you can take all of these to be 0, okay? You can design your protocol so you never have consistency violations and don't have to worry about recovery. And we know that once F is at least n over 3, R is definitely going to be potentially at least 1, and therefore D and H presumably will have to be positive. And that's about all we know prior to this work, okay? So for example, let's just start with a basic question. Let's say we just wanted to allow one consistency violation, and that's it. We do allow R equal 1, so this is a relaxed notion of consistency, and we want to recover, if there is a violation, we want to recover in bounded time with bounded rollback. Okay, bounded meaning independent of the execution, okay? So you could say, can we do, what would be the optimal fault tolerance with this relaxed notion of consistency? So that's a well-defined mathematical question. Unfortunately, the answer is pretty uninteresting. The bummer of an answer is that actually the threshold doesn't change. You don't gain any extra fault tolerance. In other words, without further assumptions, as soon as an attacker is large enough to cause a consistency violation, at that point they are also large enough to prevent recovery in a bounded amount of time or with a bounded amount of rollback, okay? So that's a negative result for this relaxed notion of consistency. So we're only going to be, if we're going to be able to achieve it, it would only be with further assumptions about the message delays. Okay? All right, let me skip this. Okay. So, like I said, we're after extra credit. We will never make any compromises about our protocols having the usual consistency and liveness guarantees in pure partial synchrony with no further assumptions. That's a hard constraint. But we're willing to consider subsets of executions in the interest of having additional guarantees, like these recovery guarantees. So here will be the subclass of executions that we consider when we speak about recovery. We call this the delta-delta star timing model. And we're going to be thinking about executions where, in addition to being partially synchronous executions, it also just so happens that even prior to GST, all of the message delays are at most some parameter delta star. Okay? So we now have two parameters, a delta and a delta star. Delta you should interpret as the speed of the network or speed of communication when everything is normal. Okay? The network is fine, there's no attacks. That might be order of hundreds of milliseconds. Delta star, so that canonically you should think of that as being a couple orders of magnitude higher. That's the speed with which honest validators can communicate when there's a problem. Okay, like the network is under a DOS attack, or there's some large adversary launching a consistency violation, something like that. Okay, that's the way to think about delta star. Large, but finite. Okay? As always, again, we're never compromising on the traditional guarantees. So if it's a small adversary, then time to finalization post-GST should scale with delta, not with delta star, order of milliseconds, not order of hours. On the other hand, for the recovery procedure, if there's a consistency violation in that anomalous case, we will be considering recovery time scaling with the large parameter delta star. So recovery, think of it as order of hours, okay? So let's ask that last question again. Let's relax consistency. We allow up to 1. Okay, so R is 1, and we want to be able to have a most 1 consistency violation, and we recover in a bounded amount of time with a bounded amount of rollback. The impossibility result from the 1980s no longer implies that this is impossible. It does imply that D and H, the recovery time and the rollback, will have to scale with delta star. Okay? So they're no longer infinite, okay? But they will have to scale with delta star. All right? So that's the question. It's not obvious from the work in the 1980s whether or not you get a boost in fault tolerance by allowing 1 consistency violation or not. And it turns out you do. Okay? The threshold that used to be 1/3 now becomes 5/9. Okay? And this is tight. And notice that 5/9 is large enough that this actually accommodates a dishonest majority. Okay? So if the adversary controls less than 5/9 of the nodes, then in fact it is possible to design a protocol which guarantees at most 1 consistency violation and bounded rollback and bounded recovery time. The rollback and recovery time have to scale with delta star, and they do, but they're only a constant factor times that lower bound of delta star. Furthermore, after recovering from the 1 consistency violation, you are not just guaranteed consistency forevermore, but you are actually also guaranteed liveness forevermore, even though you started with an adversary that was only 5/9 bounded. Okay? So that's the first special case of our results. So the picture gets a little more interesting here, right? So R equals 0, R equals 1, and here R has to be bigger than 1. That's what we know so far. So let's ask the same question with R equal 2. Suppose I was willing to tolerate 2 disruptions in consistency, again, subject to recovering in bounded time with bounded rollback from each. Now, this threshold of 5/9 jumps to 2/3. So if you have a 2/3 bounded adversary that control less than 2/3 of the validators, then in fact, while you can't sort of restrict them to 1 consistency violation, you can design a protocol that there's at most 2 consistency violations, again, each with rollback and recovery time scaling with delta star. And again, if the adversary decides to actually cause those 2 consistency violations, after the recoveries, you will not only have guaranteed consistency, you will also have guaranteed liveness, even though you started with a very large adversary initially. Okay? So that chaps up the line segment further. So here we have R equal 2. Maybe you're thinking there's going to be sort of R equal 3, R equal 4, 5, ... That turns out not to be the case. Okay, there's a second source of impossibility, right? So also in the paper, which is that once you hit 2/3, then in fact, nothing is possible. So once an adversary controls 2/3 of the validators, then they can not only cause a consistency violation, but they can also, even in a synchronous execution, prevent you from recovering for as long as they want. Intuitively, if you have a blockchain protocol which sort of remains live, even with sort of a 1/3 crashed validators, it means that if the adversary controls the complement, 2/3 of the validators, they sort of have unilateral control of the chain. Okay, the proof doesn't quite work like that, but that's pretty good intuition. So that's why there's this sort of alternative threshold at 2/3. okay? All right, so I do want to say a little bit about how this recovery procedure works. The good news is it's a very generic construction. So you hand me an accountable state machine replication protocol. I'll say what accountable means in a second, but most of the standard protocols satisfy this property, and I will simply graft on sort of a black box recovery procedure, giving you the guarantees I showed you in the preceding slides, okay? As you know, in consensus, the devil's always in the details, and so you should see the paper if you want the details. But let me just take a couple minutes to tell you kind of a cartoon, sort of high level, what are some of the ideas that go into this recovery procedure. All right, so what are some of the challenges that come up and how do we deal with them? Well, so suppose there's a consistency violation at some point. So two different validators have received messages that cause them to regard incompatible sequences of transactions as finalized. What has to happen for recovery, okay? Well, so first of all, the honest validators have to figure out at least some of the Byzantine validators responsible, okay, so that they can basically ignore those validators going forward. Otherwise, the Byzantine validators will just be able to keep creating consistency violations over and over and over again. So you have to figure out some of the responsible parties. Fortunately, over the last 5 years, there's this really sort of successful, nice theory of accountability, which tells us how to have certificates of guilt implicating actually a really large number, like at least n over 3 players, whenever you have Byzantine players, whenever you have a consistency violation. So we're going to build on that theory, and we're going to assume we're given a SMR protocol that's accountable, like Casper, Tendermint, lots of other examples, okay? Now, the second thing you're worried about is, okay, it's not good enough to know existentially that there's some certificate of guilt. The honest validators have to hear about one, in particular so that they know they need to start executing this recovery procedure. So here is one of the places we lean on the additional timing assumptions in these results, in the delta-delta star timing model. That means, in particular, that all honest validators will become aware of a consistency violation and a certificate of guilt within 2 delta star time steps of it first arising. So the hard part, in some sense, for us is, okay, honest validators have heard about the consistency violation, they've heard about certificates of guilt, but unfortunately, they've heard about different certificates of guilt, and they need to reach consensus on sort of what the new validator set is going to be going forward. Furthermore, they need to reach consensus on what the new consistent logs are going to be going forward. That is, they need to reach consensus on which transactions to roll back. And again, we only want recently finalized transactions to be rolled back. So the recovery procedure, so what we have going for us, again leaning on the delta-delta star timing model, we're only interested in recovery guarantees when that timing assumption holds, which means we can temporarily resort to a synchronous protocol that's synchronous with respect to this large parameter, delta star. So we design kind of our own, but it's sort of very closely related to, for example, synchronous hot stuff, a synchronous consensus protocol, okay? And you need to do some tweaks, just given the guarantees that we need. So this is a view-based protocol with rotating leaders. And so now a leader is going to be proposing the things people need to come to consensus on. So it's going to be proposing sort of what the certificate of guilt is, and therefore who we should be ignoring going forward, namely the implicated players by that certificate of guilt. And furthermore, they need to be proposing what are the new logs. That is, they need to propose which transactions to roll back. And the trick here is when you do voting, okay, when you're running this sort of hot stuff style protocol and you're doing voting on the leader's proposal, you do not count the votes of the validators that are implicated by the certificate of guilt in the proposal. Okay, you do not count everybody's votes, only the ones that still might be honest based on the certificate of guilt in the proposal. And what's really cool here is because you started with a 2/3 bounded adversary, after ignoring the votes of the implicated validators, you actually have an honest majority among the rest, which is what you need for these synchronous consensus protocols to have guaranteed consistency and liveness, okay? The second thing, this is to achieve the bounded rollback property. So the leader, before proposing which transactions to roll back, collects everybody else's logs. So we're again leaning on the timing assumption. They will hear from all of the honest validators within 2 delta star time steps. And this is really sort of the slick trick, which is the new log that the leader proposes is going to be the maximal, the longest log, which is a prefix of more than half of the logs it's received from the other validators. Okay, so it's going to be a prefix of every log that it's received. So it will be rolling back the transactions that are not in the prefix, and it's going to be the longest prefix subject to being extended by over half of the logs that it's heard about. Turns out, this isn't obvious, but this is something you can prove, that with this definition of which transactions to roll back, you do achieve the desired rollback property at most 2 delta star, okay? I've only talked about the symmetric case where you want the same resilience for consistency and liveness. The paper gives a complete tight solution to the asymmetric case. You can see the paper if you're interested over time, so I'll skip the related work, leave up the summary of contributions slide and during the Q&A. So thanks very much.
Thanks. Question is a clarification about the delta star. So is delta star known to the players or not?
The protocol, the question is delta star known to the players? So delta star is just like delta in the sense that it's the protocol description can depend on delta star.
Okay, so it is, so it's basically partial synchrony with delta star before GST and the partial synchrony
Yes, so again,
after.
remember the protocol has multiple guarantees. Some of the guarantees, it is completely irrelevant whether the message delays conform to delta star or not. So it's consistent whether or not you're in an execution that satisfies delta star, if f is less than n over 3. Same thing with liveness, okay? For the subset of guarantees that are with respect to the recovery procedure, those guarantees are proved only if the message delays pre-GST are at
They're
most
allowed
delta star.
to depend on delta
Okay, so if
star.
pre-GST, the message delays are bigger than delta star, we are making no claims about the approximate recovery procedure. It is still consistent and live with small adversaries, but we are making no claims about the recovery properties with large adversaries.
Okay, I think that makes sense. So when you say synchronous, you use synchronous protocol, you kind of stretch the time and pretend each step is a delta star long step. So and then you use synchronous protocol. Is that right?
Just for the
intuition?
recovery, yeah. So the way you should think about it is kind of, this protocol is zipping along, confirming things super fast. Then if there's a consistency violation noticed, kind of no progress gets made for several hours until it figures out where to restart from, and then it starts zipping along once again.
Okay, I think I get what you're talking about.
That's the way to think about it.
Thank you.
Yep.
Any other question?
Thanks for the great work. What I don't understand is why delta star is different than GST.
Good. So GST is unknown to the protocol, and delta star is fixed in advance. Delta star is known to the protocol.
Yes, but in principle, the model where you can recover is synchronous with delta star known, which kind of feels like, because you defined delta star to be the time where if things go bad, you can recover. It sounds like GST plus delta, essentially. So
yeah, so delta star is
primarily
primarily relevant pre-GST, I would say. After GST, things are largely happy, right? But again, I think what's important to remember is that there are these two categories of guarantees. There are the ones that hold whether or not the execution belongs to the delta star model, and then there are the ones that do.
Okay, so essentially you're saying that you break them apart because safety holds anyway below 1/3, and you want to keep the same model as known in partial synchrony, and then in the synchronous model, where delta star is known, you can recover above 1/3.
Above 1/3 only. And in particular, if it's below 1/3, delta star is completely irrelevant, and you will be confirming scaling with delta post-GST. So that's the thing. With a small adversary, you still want finalization time to be milliseconds or seconds, not hours. Recovery, you're only going to recover like once or twice ever in this protocol anyways, so there you're willing to tolerate this interruption on the period of hours. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. So you mentioned that after there was this violation, you would basically eliminate the people who have this certificates of fault, and then you have an honest majority, right? So then the synchronous hot stuff, for example, would work. But then, afterwards, you basically want to use the kind of the fast protocol also, right? So and for this you would need a 2/3 honesty, basically, if you don't want another violation.
Well, that depends. So this is one way to see if 5/9 feels unnatural. One place to get it is like, what would be the threshold at which, if you could sort of ignore n over 3 people, among what's left, you have 2/3 honest. So that's how 5/9 arises. So between 5/9 and 2/3, remember, we're not guaranteeing only one consistency violation, right? We're allowing 2, okay? So there is indeed still enough residual Byzantine players after the first one to cause a second one if they want. But what we can show is that 2 is it.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So we have some time. Oh, okay.
So actually, in the case of only one violation, is it conceivable that there would be a protocol whose recovery time is like optimistic in some sense? It does not scale with delta star, but scales with the actual speed of the network?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was just thinking about this morning, and I'm pretty sure Andy and I have talked about this, and we think the answer is yes.
Okay,
we haven't
yeah.
written it out.
I see.
So the question is basically, I mean, one way to phrase the question is like, what if the consistency violation happens post-GST, when you know the message delays are delta anyways?
Yes.
Then you'd like the recovery procedure to also work order of delta. That is not what's written down in our paper.
I see.
I don't see any obstacle to doing that. So yeah,
Thanks.
Good question. Yeah.
So let's thank the speaker and all speakers.
Thank you.